Her red dress glittered under the ballroom lights, but by midnight, she could barely keep her balance. The CEO everyone feared stumbled at the marble doors, glassy-eyed and alone, while her employees looked away. I was the only one who stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, do you need a ride?" The ballroom shimmered with excess, crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished marble and mirrored walls. A jazz band hummed in the corner, their muted trumpet notes threading through the clink of champagne flutes and the rise and fall of laughter. The annual gala was the kind of night everyone circled on their calendars, not because they loved it, but because it was survival. Careers could be made or broken in how one approached Vanessa King. Vanessa was more than a boss. She was an empire in motion, a woman whose presence bent every conversation in her direction. Tonight, her red gown seemed less like fabric and more like fire, pulling all eyes to her as if the whole room orbited her. Even in laughter, there was calculation. The tilt of her glass, the curve of her smile, each detail carried weight. Men whispered her name like a prayer. Women admired, envied, and feared her in equal measure. She had built her company from ambition and intellect, shielding herself with a reputation of being untouchable. On the outer ring of the room, Ethan Williams stood with a glass of water in his hand. His jacket was pressed but plain, his shoes shined yet worn at the edges. 32 years old, responsibility had carved itself into his shoulders and his eyes. While others scanned the room for opportunities, Ethan watched in silence, unmoved by the dazzling parade. His mind was elsewhere, on Lily, his daughter, asleep at home under the neighbor's care. He had promised himself years ago that he would not waste nights chasing empty laughter when there was a child depending on him. Every time a server passed with champagne, Ethan's gaze sharpened, not with temptation, but memory. His late wife Emily's face flickered at the edges of his thoughts, her laugh swallowed by the echo of tires on wet asphalt, the phone call that had split his life into before and after. Since then, alcohol hadn't been indulgence, it was warning. Tonight, as he watched the golden bubbles fizz in glass after glass, he only felt distance. Across the ballroom, Vanessa's laugh rang louder than before, carrying a sharper edge. She raised her glass again, and for the first time, her steps faltered, just slightly, but enough for Ethan to notice. Where others averted their eyes, pretending not to see their flawless so lose balance, Ethan's expression tightened. The night was beginning to change. Ethan shifted his weight near the far wall, away from the chatter that spilled endlessly across the ballroom floor. His hand tightened around his water glass, condensation gathering between his fingers. It wasn't discomfort that kept him apart, it was choice. He knew his place in this room. He wasn't one of the hopefuls angling for attention, nor one of the polished executives rehearsing lines to impress Vanessa King. He was here because attendance was mandatory, another item on the list of obligations that fed his paycheck, the paycheck that fed his daughter. Lily. The thought of her was constant, a quiet pulse beneath every decision. She would be asleep by now, her small chest rising and falling under the quilt his late wife had sewn. He had left her with Mrs. Carter next door, a dependable neighbor who understood the strange balance of Ethan's life. Father first, employee second. The gala blurred around him, a swirl of sequins, perfume, and false laughter, but his mind carried him somewhere else. Back to the night everything had fractured. Emily's voice had been on the other end of the line, promising she'd be home soon. He remembered the sound of rain, the echo of tires against wet pavement, and then silence before the voice of a stranger delivered the words no husband should ever hear. A drunk driver, an accident, a life stolen in an instant. Since then, Ethan's world had narrowed to what mattered most: keeping Lily safe, giving her the stability he had lost. Alcohol had no place in that promise. It wasn't temptation, it was a grave marker. Every fizzing glass at this gala was another reminder of what recklessness cost. Across the room, Vanessa's laughter rose again, sharp and uneven, her glass perpetually replenished. Assistants had vanished, the chauffeur absent. A few glanced at her, murmured, then looked away quickly. Nobody wanted to be responsible for the powerful woman unraveling before them. Ethan watched her, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He didn't want to be here, yet something inside him whispered, "Don't leave her like this." The night was shifting. He could feel it, the moment where everyone else would turn their back. But he had lived the aftermath of turning away. He would not repeat it. The gala began to thin as midnight approached. Laughter drained from the ballroom, replaced by the shuffle of guests eager to slip away without being caught in their boss's shadow. Vanessa remained at the center of it all, her once poised figure softened now by too many glasses of champagne. Her sharp eyes, the ones that usually cut through excuses like glass, had grown glassy themselves. Ethan lingered near the exit, debating. His shift tomorrow began early, and Lily would wake with her usual boundless energy, expecting pancakes before school. But his gaze couldn't shake free of Vanessa. She moved toward the entrance with uneven grace, heels clicking against marble like a metronome struggling to keep rhythm. The grand doors loomed ahead, and for a second she faltered, hand reaching for the frame as if the entire weight of her empire suddenly pressed against her shoulders. "Ma'am," Ethan said carefully, stepping forward, his voice pitched low so it wouldn't carry. "Do you need a ride?" She turned, startled, her pupils slow to find him. "Williams," she slurred faintly, the syllables rolling together. "The single dad, right?" Her lips curved into a bitter smile that lacked its usual precision. "Yes," he answered simply, keeping his tone even. "Let me drive you home. It's late. It's not safe." Her pride rose like a shield, even dulled by alcohol. "I don't need your help. I have drivers. Cars. Everything." Ethan didn't flinch. He stood steady, his hand loosely at his side. "Not tonight, you don't." He gestured toward the empty valet stand, the vanished assistants. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Please trust me." The words hung between them, heavy, daring her to test their truth. For a long moment, Vanessa stared as if weighing a deal. Finally, she let out a frustrated sigh, the kind of sound that came from losing a battle she hadn't expected to fight. Without another protest, she let him guide her forward. The sight of his modest sedan waiting at the curb pulled a scoff from her lips. "This," she muttered, waving a hand. "You drive this?" Ethan smiled faintly, unbothered. "It gets me where I need to go." Her heels clicked one last time against the marble before she slid reluctantly into the passenger seat. For the first time that night, Ethan exhaled. The door shut with a muted thud, sealing Vanessa inside a world that did not belong to her. The interior of Ethan's car smelled faintly of soap and pine from an air freshener clipped to the vent. It was tidy but plain, no leather seats, no tinted glass, no luxury screens glowing across the dash. To Vanessa, used to chauffeurs and limousines, it felt almost alien. She shifted against the seat, her sequin dress rustling as she tried to find comfort, arms crossed as though she could still command the night. Ethan fastened his own seat belt and glanced sideways. "You'll want yours on," he said gently. Her pride bristled again, but her fingers obeyed. The click of the buckle echoed louder than the jazz still lingering in her ears. As the car rolled forward, the hotel lights receded in the rear view, swallowed by the darker pulse of the city. For a while, silence filled the space, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint rattle of a loose coin in the cup holder. Vanessa leaned her head against the cool window, the blur of neon smearing past like a painting washed in rain. Words slipped out before she could cage them. "You know what it's like, Williams," she murmured. "Everyone thinks success is glamorous. That power makes you invincible." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "But it's lonely. They don't see me. They see the CEO, not the woman." Ethan's eyes stayed on the road, steady, but his jaw tightened at the tone of her voice. "I think everyone has their battles," he said quietly. "Some just hide them better than others." Her gaze flicked to him, sharper now, curiosity breaking through the haze. "And what's yours?" His grip on the wheel firmed, knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard. He hesitated, the way a man does before reopening an old wound. Finally, his voice came low, deliberate. "I lost my wife. Drunk driver. Since then, my battle is making sure my daughter grows up safe, with someone who won't let her down." The words cut through the fog of champagne like cold water. Vanessa blinked, sobered for a moment by the quiet weight in his tone. She saw him then, not as the single father employee at the edge of her meetings, but as a man carved by grief and refusing to surrender to it. The city lights stretched ahead, endless, while inside the car two lives, one hardened by loneliness, the other by loss, brushed against each other in unspoken recognition. The elevator chimed softly as Ethan guided Vanessa into the soaring lobby of her building. Polished marble reflected the glow of chandeliers overhead, and the concierge glanced up with a start before wisely turning his eyes away. Vanessa's reputation followed her even here, untouchable, commanding. Except tonight, she leaned on Ethan's steady arm, her heels snagging slightly on the plush carpet. Her penthouse was perched high above the city, an ocean of glass walls framing a skyline that glittered like spilled diamonds. Ethan didn't linger on the wealth that surrounded him. He had long ago stopped measuring himself against people like her. To him, this wasn't a palace. It was simply the place where she needed to be safe tonight. "Sit," he said gently, easing her onto a sleek white sofa. She sank down, exhaling sharply, one hand pressing against her temple. Without hesitation, Ethan crossed to the kitchen, filled a crystal glass with water, and set it on the table before her. "You'll feel better after this," he murmured. Vanessa's eyes fluttered up to him, glazed but searching. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, voice rough at the edges. "You could have left. You could laugh about this tomorrow with the others." Ethan's expression didn't waver. He stood tall but calm, hands loose at his sides. "Because I know what it's like when no one's there," he said quietly. The simplicity of the words carried more weight than any speech. She stared at him for a long beat, the hard lines of her pride softening into something vulnerable, almost fragile. For a woman who had built her identity on control, this was dangerous ground. Yet Ethan didn't take advantage, didn't gloat. He only gave her space to breathe. "Good night, ma'am," he added softly, respectful as ever. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him was gentle, almost careful, as if he knew she needed silence more than anything else. Vanessa sat in the vast quiet of her penthouse, staring at the untouched water, wondering when was the last time someone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, too bright for the state Vanessa found herself in. She winced, pressing a hand to her temple as the memories began to stitch themselves back together. The gala, the champagne, the stumble at the marble doorway. And then, Williams. Ethan Williams, steady where she had been unsteady, patient where her pride had frayed. She rose slowly, every movement reminding her of how far she had let herself fall. The untouched glass of water still sat on the low table, condensation dried into a faint ring on the surface. She stared at it for a long time, a simple reminder that someone had thought first of her well-being, not her image. The shame came next, curling hot in her chest. Vanessa King had spent years building walls around herself, teaching the world to see only the polished surface. Last night, one man had seen past it all, and instead of mocking, instead of gossiping, he had carried her home with quiet dignity. Later that day, back in the glass-walled office tower where she reigned, Vanessa sat at her desk with her usual precision. Papers aligned, schedule tight, staff moving quickly under her sharp gaze. Yet beneath the routine, something restless stirred. She pressed the intercom. "Send Williams, Indiana." When Ethan walked through the door, he looked uneasy, as though bracing for reprimand. His hands were clasped behind his back, shoulders squared. "You asked for me, ma'am?" Vanessa studied him, her expression softer than anyone in that office had likely ever seen. For a moment, she said nothing, simply considering the man who had lifted her out of humiliation without demanding recognition. "Williams," she began, her voice low but steady. "Thank you for last night." He nodded, awkward but sincere. "Just doing the right thing." "No," she said firmly, leaning forward. "You went beyond that. You reminded me of something I forgot. That kindness is rarer than power. You didn't take advantage. You didn't gossip. You respected me even when I couldn't respect myself." For the first time, Ethan saw not the CEO, but a woman acknowledging her own cracks in the armor. He bowed his head slightly, humbled. She allowed the silence to stretch, both of them understanding that something had shifted, subtly, but permanently. The weeks that followed unfolded with quiet but unmistakable changes. Vanessa King remained the same formidable leader in the eyes of most, her standards no less demanding, her authority no less sharp. Yet those who worked closest to her began to sense a shift, subtle enough that no one could quite put their finger on it. Meetings felt different. Conversations carried more space for listening. And at the center of it all was the way she looked at Ethan Williams. It began with small things. She asked about his daughter, Lily, during a morning briefing, the question so unexpected that the room fell briefly silent. Ethan had answered carefully, almost unsure whether it was safe to let his private world bleed into his professional one. But Vanessa listened, really listened, as though it mattered. Soon after, in a strategy session where voices clashed and executives scrambled to impress, she paused and turned to him. Williams, what do you think? The question carried weight, not a test, but an invitation. Ethan, unused to such attention, had cleared his throat and spoken plainly, without polish or ambition. To his surprise, she nodded, taking his words into account as though they held the same currency as the seasoned analysts around him. Whispers began among colleagues. The CEO seemed different. Not softer, but more human. Some thought Ethan must have done something, though no one knew what. Others dismissed it as Vanessa's passing whim. Ethan ignored the speculation. He wasn't chasing status. His world still revolved around the little girl waiting at home for bedtime stories. For Vanessa, however, the change ran deeper. She had spent years convincing herself that vulnerability was weakness. Yet Ethan's quiet strength, his refusal to seek anything in return for kindness, had forced her to reconsider. His presence reminded her that authority and humanity did not have to cancel each other out. Over time, their exchanges grew steadier, no longer bound by the walls of hierarchy. There was trust now, tentative, unspoken, but real. And in that trust, both of them found something they hadn't expected, the beginnings of a bond strong enough to shift the way they carried themselves in a world that demanded too much. Months later, the city moved at its usual relentless pace, but for Ethan the rhythm of life had steadied. Workdays still ended with him racing home to Lily, evenings marked by homework and bedtime stories. Yet there was something new threaded through those weeks. Conversations with Vanessa that no longer felt like duties between a CEO and her employee, but like exchanges between two people who had chosen to see each other clearly. One evening, after the last meeting had bled into dusk, Vanessa closed her office with a quiet finality. Ethan had been gathering reports, ready to head out, when she appeared at his side. "Walk with me," she asked, her tone stripped of command, softened into something closer to request. They stepped out into the evening air. The city was bathed in copper light, skyscrapers edged in gold as the sun slid low against the horizon. For once, Vanessa wasn't surrounded by assistants, drivers, or the aura of untouchable power. It was just her and Ethan, their footsteps sinking as they moved down the busy street. Silence stretched comfortably at first, the kind of silence that spoke of trust rather than absence. Vanessa's gaze lifted to the skyline, but her hand brushed against his as though by accident. Ethan slowed, glancing down, uncertain. She hesitated, then, deliberately this time, reached for his hand. Ethan's first instinct was surprise. His life had been built on discipline, on boundaries he had drawn to protect Lily, to protect himself from wounds reopening. Yet here, in the fading light, he didn't pull away. Their hands fit together with an ease that unsettled him not because it was wrong, but because it felt right. Neither spoke of what it meant. The city roared around them. Horns, voices, the steady hum of traffic, but within the small space between them there was quiet. A bond had formed, not of status or power, not of desperation or escape, but of two people who had once stood alone and now chose, tentatively, to walk side by side. As the sun slipped behind the buildings, painting the sky in violet and rose, Ethan glanced at her and found her already watching him. She didn't smile. Vanessa King rarely did. But there was something in her eyes that told him the wall she had built for years had shifted. And in that look, Ethan felt something he had thought impossible, the beginning of hope.